Blessed be God. Amen. This is a night of remembrance. Our Old Testament reading for Maundy Thursday recounts the first Passover of the ancient Hebrews, who at this time were still in bondage and slavery under the Pharaoh of Egypt. They were instructed by Moses to put the blood of a lamb on their doorpost so the angel of death would pass over their houses and not strike down their firstborn that evening. While Scripture does not exactly tell us how God's people spent this evening, it is quite easy to imagine that they did so with a bit of anxiety and worry. Were they afraid to go outside? Were they cautioned against going to visit neighbors, and if they did, were they to keep their distance? Fast forward 2,000 years to our gospel reading, and we find Jesus and his disciples sitting around a table for dinner. They know something big is about to happen, but they cannot fully put their minds and hearts around exactly what that might be. Were they too worried and afraid, much like their ancestors, not knowing what the next day would bring? And then, into the middle of all this tension, Jesus removes his outer cloak, grabs a towel, and washes his disciples' feet, an act fit only for the lowliest of servants. And then he tells them that there is one commandment to remember if they forget everything else, and that commandment is to love one another. No matter what happens, if you love one another as Jesus has loved us, they will be known as the ones who belong to Jesus. This is the night. Every night of the great 3 days is a night for us to remember the works of love that God has done for all of his children. Tomorrow, we remember Christ's agony and death on the cross, showing God's victory over the power of sin. And then the next night, we remember Christ rising from the tomb, showing God's victory over the power of death. And now tonight, we remember Christ's act of great humility, his commandment to love one another as we have been loved by God. And we are to remember that he gave us a physical, tangible way that we can taste and see that yes, God really is good, and we can be assured of God's ever-abiding presence with us. The great irony of that last statement is that this year, while we may remember that night, we're not allowed to partake of that presence in any physical, tangible way. For our faith is acted out in rituals that require touch and taste. Many have called it a season of fasting, but I think a better term might be that we have been sent into exile. For fasting is something that we normally do voluntarily, rather than it being forced upon us due to the circumstances of the day. Now, to be clear, this exile of not being able to partake of Christ's body and blood in the Eucharist is something that, while a burden that we did not choose, it is a burden that we are able to bear with love. For the cost of celebrating the presence of Christ in the bread and wine is too high, as it puts everyone at risk. If the world is to know that we are followers of Christ by how we love each other, then it must be said that sometimes that means love requires sacrifices of things which give us life. It means not being able to hug or shake the hand of someone who does not live with us. It means seeing our friends and family on a screen or simply hearing their voice. And I am so old that I remember one of the great social questions of the day was, how can we live without using our phone so much? And now it has become that technology is now a lifeline for us. It keeps us from being completely cut off from one another. This is the night when we see just how much Christ loves us. For Scripture tells us that the Son of God is the one by whom all things were made. And then that same Son emptied himself into the form of a helpless baby and lived among us as one of us. And that same Son of God tonight empties himself even further and washes the feet of those who call him teacher and master. If the Son of God can do this, can we not let go of our own freedoms of movement and all of our privileges for the sake of those whom we love for even just a little while? Holy Week is the week where we remember as a community, whether gathered or dispersed, the mighty acts of love which God has done for his children. And in my own reflections of things, I remember some of the things that have been said and the stories that have been told over the course of my time with you. I remember telling a story about someone who was diagnosed with an incurable disease, that they prayed for healing, but the healing of the body never came. However, they were healed of the fear of sickness and death and found true peace that only comes from knowing and being known and loved by God. I remember the story of how playing Monopoly with my grandmother taught me more about God's love and abundance than any Bible study that I have ever sat through. And I remember that any time that God remembers his children in pages of Scripture, God acts to deliver them, whether it was Noah in the ark, the ancient Hebrews in slavery in Egypt, or whether it's the Israelites who were in exile in Babylon. We cannot wash each other's feet this evening, but we can wash each other's hands at home while we sing, Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom. We cannot participate in the stripping of the altar, but we can clear off the sacred spaces in our houses. We cannot partake in the bread and the wine that is the presence of Christ, but we can keep a piece of bread, a biscuit, or even a dinner roll, and leave it overnight on that sacred space. And when we look at it tonight, and even when we eat it in the morning, we can remember the love of a God so great that there is no need to fear or to be consumed by worry or overcome by depression, even in the face of sickness and death. Dear people of God, this is the night when we can remember that God remembers us, that God sees us, that God hears us, and God is coming to deliver us. Amen.
O God, you are my God. Eagerly I seek you. O God, you are my God. Eagerly I seek you. O God, you are my God. Eagerly I seek you. My soul thirsts for you, my flesh faints for you, as in a barren and dry land where there is no water. Therefore I have gazed upon you in your holy place, that I might behold your power and your glory. O God, you are my God. Eagerly I seek you. For your loving kindness is better than life itself. My lips shall give you praise. So will I bless you as long as I live, and lift up my hands